Everyone. Thank you all for joining me for this talk. I really look forward to it. My name is John Roozenbeek. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge, Department of Psychology, and I wrote my PhD at Cambridge's Department of Slavonic Studies. For my PhD, I worked on media narratives in Eastern Ukraine, specifically in Donbass and in the war zone that's currently there. But for my postdoctoral research, I work on misinformation more generally. So I don't specifically look at Ukraine anymore, although that's still part of my research, but my main focus is on, the title of my presentation, Vaccines Against Fake News, Misinformation, or Propaganda, or whatever you might want to call it. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have after the talk. I have about 15 minutes. If there's not enough time, or there's not enough time for your question or something like that, please send me an email. You can find my email probably in too many places online, but it will also be shown at the end of the talk. So what I want to do today, at first I want to discuss the fake news or misinformation problem, and kind of explain why it's such a complicated issue to deal with. Not only why it's a problem, but also why the solutions that we have currently are pretty imperfect. After that, I also want to discuss, not just the solutions that have been proposed by social media companies or governments or fact checkers, but also some of the stuff that we have been doing. So I will discuss some of my work and how we have applied that work in real world settings, and well, hopefully you'll find it interesting. So this is a headline from 8 years ago now, from 2012. And obviously this is fake news, as you might know. Unfortunately for Kim Jong-un, he was not named the sexiest man alive for 2012. But the nice thing about this was that a Chinese website, People's Daily, I believe it's called, a news site, which is run by, state journalists. So they're basically a propaganda outfit. They thought that this was real, even though The Onion, as you may know, is a satirical website. So they don't produce real news, they produce joke news. But this Chinese website thought it was real, so they reposted this article with a slideshow of Kim Jong-un sitting on a horse, or, visiting factories and all that. And they copied directly the praise that was lavished onto Kim Jong-un by The Onion, fake praise, obviously. And I think we can all agree that that's hilarious. At least I think it's hilarious. And even though it's fake news, it isn't a problem, right? It's satire, it's a joke. And even if it is taken seriously by someone, the fact that someone might take it seriously isn't harmful in many cases. However, this is another example of what you might call fake news. So this is a photo that circulated on Facebook. I think it was in this year still, so March of 2020. Maybe it was 2019, but it doesn't really matter. And this says fathers don't deserve a day and Father's Day, which is obviously very inflammatory, but it's also fake because the signs that these women are holding have been photoshopped. So the original signs didn't actually say this, they said something else. But Quinn Cinco, this gentleman who is part of this Facebook group, thought that this was real. So he was incredibly outraged by it. And this is where we can see that this kind of fake news, or these kinds of manipulations, do a bit of damage, even though they're very simple. So what this does, essentially, is someone like Quinn Cinco, who falls for this, now thinks that there's a movement out there that wants to end Father's Day, even though there isn't. Or maybe there is, but not to my knowledge, at least. So that leads essentially to polarization, right? It leads Mr. Quinn Cinco and maybe others also to think of, let's say, the feminist movement as very extreme, even though it isn't, right? So that's how you achieve basically the effect of groups in society being driven apart in some way. Another example is this one. This is also from this year, March of this year. It's a news story that's real by NBC News, which is an American news outlet, and it says a man from South Carolina and his 9-year-old daughter were killed by a fellow hunter who mistook them for a deer, which is very tragic. And here, this is an example of something that is not fake news, but that is nonetheless achieves the same effect. Right, so MAGA Billy, for those of you who don't know, that's a concatenation of MAGA, which is Donald Trump's slogan for Make America Great Again, and hillbilly, which is an American word for hick or farmer or someone who's not very well educated. So what this tweet essentially says is, good, I'm glad that these people died because that means there are fewer people who will vote for Trump, right? Which is obviously incredibly offensive, and it is, generally frowned upon to wish death upon people because they are your political opponents. So obviously this tweet went viral. A lot of people were very angry about it, and a lot of people thought, or began to think, or maybe already thought, that this is representative of a significant number of people in the country who actually believe that the left-wing Americans, let's say, want Donald Trump supporters to die, which the vast majority of them don't. So, but this is not fake. That's the issue. So it's not fake news. It might be someone's real opinion, but it nonetheless achieves the same effect as the previous slide, which was fake because the photo in the previous slide was manipulated and the text was changed. So that means that you really don't need to lie to achieve your goals. If your goal is, for example, to increase polarization in society, to make people, very angry at each other or something else. So that also makes the solutions to the problem much more complicated, because the solution cannot be, well, we just have to delete fake news and leave real news online, because then you're not targeting this type of content that you see on the screen here. And you might target, the type of content that is harmless, for example, when it comes to Kim Jong-un's sexiest man alive photo. So how do people go about solving this problem? Usually there's about 4 ways to do it. Number 1 is with algorithms. Number 2 is with legislation. Number 3 is with corrections and specifically fact-checking. And number 4 is education, or what you usually would call media literacy. So I will discuss each of these solutions not in great detail because I don't want to bore everyone here, but a little bit just so we know what we're talking about, and I'll also discuss some of the shortcomings of these solutions. Number 1, algorithms. So why don't we, let's say, get rid of all of the bots, right? Let's say we have a perfect algorithm that detects non-genuine content, the kind of content that is spread by bots that are looking to spread fake news on social media, let's say, which is a serious problem. Turns out that 17% approximately of all Twitter accounts are bots, according to this research. Approximately. We don't quite know for sure, but something along those lines. So if you delete 17% of all Twitter accounts, Twitter is not going to like that very much, because Twitter doesn't want to lose 17% of its user base in one go. So that is unlikely to be agreed upon by Twitter. Another problem is, we can remove bots, but what does that solve? What does that actually do? And this paper is really good. It's from 2018, The Spread of True and False News Online. And essentially the paper argues that fake news spreads faster and farther than real news on Twitter. And you can see that in these graphs. I myself am pretty colorblind, so I have difficulty seeing this. But the red line is fake news in each graph, and the green one is real news. And here you can see that the red line basically reaches more people on average than the green line, meaning more people see fake news than real news. Another conclusion from this paper that's very important is that most content, most fake news is not spread by bots, but by real people. And that means that if we get rid of all the bots, we don't get rid of the problem. necessarily, because people will still be spreading fake news, and it will still spread faster and farther and deeper into different echo chambers and networks on social media than others. So that is a bit of an issue. Another issue with algorithms is that they aren't very good. So as I explained earlier with my examples, algorithms are very bad at picking up on the nuances that exist between fake and real, harmful and not harmful. They simply aren't very good at it. Even the best AI, artificial intelligence that we have for spotting fake news is still pretty bad, right? So the idea that algorithms can solve the problem for us is a bit optimistic in many ways, which is unfortunate. That doesn't mean, of course, that algorithms are useless. They aren't. But I think it's a mistake, personally, to rely on algorithms as a solution without doing anything else, because it won't be enough. Okay, second thing, second category of solutions is laws, legislation. So as you can see here, I pasted a couple of screenshots from different countries, different news outlets. So Singapore, Malaysia as well, and Germany, they have passed laws and legislation recently aimed at curbing specifically the spread of fake news. So this is new legislation that exists on top of the old legislation about like slander, for example, or what is that called? There's a specific word for it that I forget. That isn't slander, but like the written form of slander. Defamation, that's it. So that's one thing. You can do this, but it has two negative consequences. Number one, this is a very particular issue. So if Germany, which is a democratic country, passes a law that says we limit the spread of fake news, we make it illegal to do so, what you see happening is that countries that do not have a democratic tradition and that are much more likely to crack down on freedom of the press, such as Syria and Russia, they point to Germany, in this case, to justify their own fake news legislation. And that fake news legislation is not aimed at genuinely solving the problem, but rather it is used as an excuse in some instances to crack down on opposition, freedom of the press, critical journalists, etc., which obviously is a massive problem and an unintended consequence of using legislation to fight the problem. Another issue that we have with fake news legislation is that obviously in the countries themselves, it leads to discussions about freedom of the press and what you are and are not allowed to say online. So this is very, very complex, of course. So in Germany, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, which is a law that was passed a couple of years ago in Germany, basically mandates social media companies to remove harmful content. Otherwise, they risk a fine. And in principle, that sounds like a good idea, but then that also leaves it up to the social media companies to decide if something counts as harmful or not. So not necessarily fake or real, but harmful. Hate speech, let's say. But what if something is posted online that is sort of borderline, sort of somewhere in the middle, could be seen as hate speech by some, but not by others? And it's very much a discussion about which of the two is actually true. In that case, what you see happen in Germany is that a lot of social media companies don't want to risk getting fined and therefore delete things or remove things from the internet that they will see as being hate speech, even though you can have a very reasonable discussion about whether it counts as hate speech or if it's something else, namely an opinion. And that obviously becomes a problem because then you very strongly limit the extent of the possible discussions on social media, and that also makes the internet a less free space for discussion. And that obviously a lot of people don't like that. Other people would argue that it doesn't really matter because if it's borderline, it shouldn't be online anyway. But however you slice it, it does lead to very important, significant discussions, and also not everyone is happy with this solution, that's for sure. So, third solution, corrections or fact-checking. Obviously, it's important to fact-check, right? It's if someone is lying on the internet, then why would you not correct them if they're wrong. That makes sense. But what many people seem to forget when thinking about fact-checking is two things. Number one, as I discussed before, the lie spreads faster than the truth, generally speaking, at least on social media. So if you're doing a fact check, which is a fact, it will not reach or not likely reach as many people as the original lie. So then, yes, you fact checked something, but a lot of people are never going to see the fact check. So they will continue to believe the lie that they were learned in the first place. A second issue is this, namely, fact checks might backfire. So this was an article from The Guardian where a fake news article was labeled fake news, and rightfully so, because it was fake, by Facebook. And Facebook warned users against sharing it. And the only thing that did was it reached more people, because people started clicking on it because they don't trust Facebook, and therefore thought, well, if Facebook says it's fake, it must be real somehow. So that didn't achieve the consequences that they had hoped for, which is unfortunate. Okay, next point. Maybe we can educate ourselves. Education, media literacy, of course, everyone's heard of it. It's very important. And obviously, I support educational efforts, but there are a few things with education that many people don't seem to think about initially when thinking about education as a solution to misinformation. This is one of them. So this is a paper from a couple of years ago, 1 year ago, actually, 2019, by Andrew Guess and colleagues. And this paper says biggest predictor for believing or falling for misinformation on Facebook is being over 65, or being older. Well, that also means that we're in a bit of trouble because people who are over 65 don't go to school anymore, nor are they interested in it. And that is a bit of an issue, because if we are trying to limit the spread or prevalence of misinformation on the internet, we cannot just focus on children or young people because they are not the only ones on the internet anymore, if they ever were. So there's that. Second thing with education is it's not the same as mathematics. Like, I learned mathematics in high school a long time ago, and I still remember a few things, not many, but some. And it's basically the same. If I were to learn mathematics now, it would be the same thing that it was 15 years ago. But when it comes to media literacy, it changes all the time, right? So something that I learned today might be completely irrelevant 5 years down the line, because the misinformation has changed, the solutions have changed, the internet has changed, everything has changed, so it doesn't work the same way, so then the solutions aren't the same either. Right, so that's why you cannot really rely on a one-off moment of education as a fix for this problem. Right. So, what do you do instead? And this is one of the questions that I'm trying to solve in my research. And the very interesting thing is, what we try to do is basically the same as what Professor Snape tries to do in Harry Potter, at least in the first 5, I believe. Namely, you need a defense system against misinformation in some way. And this defense system has to be inventive and adaptive, and has to work at the psychological level, and has to be updated in some way constantly, almost, so that people become more psychologically resilient to misinformation or whatever it might look like even in the future. Luckily, there is a framework in social psychology that works basically on this level, which is called Inoculation Theory. And Inoculation Theory is basically the idea of building psychological vaccinations against, deception attempts, if you will. So, Inoculation theory is from the 1960s. It's quite old and it's quite robust, thankfully. So there's a lot of research that has been done on how effective inoculation theory is as a way to prevent persuasion. And the way it works is essentially the same as a real vaccine. namely by introducing a weakened version of a misleading argument, or in the case of a real vaccine, if you introduce a weakened version of a particular virus, let's say, the body starts to create antibodies in the case of a real virus and mental antibodies in the case of psychological inoculation. So the idea is you expose people to a weakened version of a misleading argument, and people begin to think their way through what that argument, why that argument doesn't work or why it's deceptive. So then the next time when someone is exposed to a real misleading argument, they are more resistant to it and less likely to be persuaded by it. So how did we apply this? So this is a really useful framework, but it's not very scalable because usually, or at least in the past, inoculation theory focused quite a lot on individual malicious or deceptive arguments. For example, climate change is fake. I don't know, something like that, right? But what we tried to do was, okay, what if you can use inoculation theory to inoculate people against misinformation techniques? So against conspiracy theories in general. And you preemptively induce psychological resistance against conspiracy theory, any conspiracy theory that people might come up with, not just specific ones, anyone they will encounter in the future. And if so, does that actually work? And third question, maybe even the most important one, okay, even if that does work, how do you design an inoculation that people voluntarily take, right? And our solution, this is 2 years ago now, was a computer game. And this is the first version of that computer game, and it's called Bad News. And Bad News is basically our first psychological vaccine against 6 common misinformation techniques. So these are the 6 that I mean. Polarization, as I mentioned before, like trying to drive groups in society apart. Impersonation, meaning impersonating someone online, pretending to be someone you're not. Conspiracy theories, trolling, like baiting people into responding very emotionally. The use of emotional language and trigger points and trigger words to evoke outrage or anger or sadness of some kind. And discrediting opponents through ad hominem attacks. So how do you create content online that discredits governments, news organizations, anything, in a deceptive manner? So this is what the game looks like. In the game, you are basically the bad guy. So you take on the role of fake news creator. And it's very simple. So you have a follower meter, you have a credibility meter, and you can click buttons to take different actions in the game. So here, for example, you can impersonate, as one of the techniques that I mentioned, impersonate not Donald Trump, but Donald Trump with an N. And you can put this on the fictional Twitter in the game environment, and people will go crazy because they think that the real Donald Trump has declared war on North Korea when he really hasn't, right? And you do this over 6 different scenarios, and in so doing, you learn how these techniques work. Obviously, I'm a scientist, so it's very important to also measure if what you're doing is effective. So one of the things we did was we included a survey in the game that people can voluntarily participate in, and the survey pops up before you start playing and after you're done playing. And then we basically give people a couple of headlines. Some of them are, fake, and some of them are not fake. Some of them are manipulative, and some of them are not manipulative. And we ask people to rate them on a scale from 1 to 7 in terms of how reliable they are. And what we hope to see, which is also what we consistently basically see, is people after playing rate fake headlines as less reliable than before playing. And also, if you compare people who play the game, Bad News, to a control group, which does something completely different, the people who play the game are consistently much better at spotting misinformation. So we have a couple of publications out about this, and I'm very happy to send them over to you if you're interested in them. But they all basically show the same results, so we're quite happy with how robust these results are. One of the things that we measured, for example, is, okay, what happens, like how long does the effect of the inoculation by playing the game last? And we find that with periodic reminders, it lasts up to 13 weeks. So that's really good, right? You play the game once, and then a couple of times, once per week, very briefly reminded of what you learned. And then that means that people continue to have more psychological resistance against future misinformation. So that's great news, right? We also tested if the game works across different countries. And we translated the bad news game to 18 or 19 languages now. So yeah, we have a paper out which checks that, and basically the results are very consistent across different countries. So that's also leads us to think that it's not just in English that this works, but also in, well, in this case, German, Greek, and Polish. But we now also have versions in Estonian, not Latvian to my knowledge, but Estonian, yes. Swedish, what else? A whole lot of Eastern European languages, including Serbian, Bosnian. Let me think. Is there anything else? Russian, Ukrainian, of course. So it's becoming sort of this larger scale inoculation project that exists sort of internationally. Yeah. Another thing that we did was we translated, or we adapted the game to be more applicable for younger audiences. So the regular bad news game you can play for free without any ads or anything, just in your browser at www.getbadnews.com. But also, if you want to play the version for younger children, age 8 to 10, maybe up to 12, you can play that at getbadnews.com/junior. So because this approach was very successful, we've also applied it in other issue domains that are really important. For example, misinformation on direct messaging apps, which is a significant issue, especially in countries like India, Brazil, and also Mexico, where apps like WhatsApp and Telegram are used more as social networks than they are in the United Kingdom, where I live, or in the Netherlands, where I'm from, for example. Right, so large WhatsApp groups where people have the opportunity to spread a lot of information, and some of it is just fake. And it turns out that rumors actually spread really fast on these apps, but they don't spread in exactly the same way as they do on Facebook. But it becomes a huge problem in some instances. So we collaborated with WhatsApp to design another game that we want to implement in WhatsApp itself. We haven't done that yet. That will be hopefully for the future. Called Join This Group, which is about 10 minutes. And in this group, in this game, you learn about specifically how misinformation can spread on text messaging apps and what kind of consequences this can have. So we did a really large study a while ago last year with 923 active WhatsApp users in the UK. And we basically gave them 16 examples of like WhatsApp conversations that we consider to be harmful or manipulative in some way. And we asked them, okay, how reliable do you find this message? How confident are you in your judgment? And how likely are you to share this with others? And we did this immediately after people played the game. That's the one group. Another group was a control group which played another game, Tetris, which is unrelated to misinformation. We also had a 1 week follow-up, 1 week after they played, to see if the effects are still significant 1 week after. And it turns out that that is true. So reliability for the inoculation condition, which is the group that played the game, you see that they, like immediately after playing in the post, right, you see that the reliability of WhatsApp posts is much lower than for the control group. And this effect remains significant even 1 week after playing. So that's good. We find the same for confidence. So people who play the game are much more confident in their ability to spot misinformation, which is good, because then they are they feel more empowered and more capable of their own, of their own judgment, of their ability to spot malicious content online. And also what we find is that people who play the game are significantly less likely to report wanting to share misinformation with their peers. in their own networks, which is a really good proxy for reducing actually the spread of misinformation, right? Because people are simply less likely to report wanting to forward misinformation to their friends and family, which hopefully, at least in the real world, also means that it will spread less once enough people have been inoculated. Right. Another project that we've been working on is about extremism, so online radicalization. That is in collaboration with an organization in Beirut. And with them, we designed Radicalize, which is a game about radicalization and extremism. And here the idea is also to build resilience against radicalization recruitment, which you might commonly encounter online, but also in the real world. Right. So the whole point is to help people build resilience against recruitment strategies. So what does it look like to be recruited by an extremist organization, and how do you defend against it? And we first built an English language prototype. Currently, we're almost finished with the Arabic language translation, which we will test in different environments. Specifically, hopefully, if all goes well, it depends a little bit on how Lebanon is going to be doing in the next months. We will be testing this in refugee camps in Lebanon. And the game consists of 4 strategies: identification, so how do you identify a vulnerable target? How do you gain their trust? How do you isolate them from their environment? And how do you activate them to be ready to commit an extremist act of some kind? So that basically looks like this. This is the front page. The extremist organization that you're recruiting for in the game is called the Anti-ICE Freedom Front, which is fake. It doesn't exist. And also, to my knowledge, its cause isn't very popular among extremists. So that is also how we managed to keep the game apolitical and irreligious. And here we find the same thing. So people who play the game find manipulative WhatsApp messages that follow these recruitment strategies significantly more manipulative than people in the control group. And it's actually a huge effect. So that's really, really good. That's a paper that's hopefully about to be published very soon. Another project we've been working on with the Department of Homeland Security in the United States and the Global Engagement Center is Harmony Square, which is about political misinformation. It's also a bit like bad news, but more like an upgrade where you learn how to troll. So how to drive groups apart. And the example that I gave of the hunting accident at the beginning is a really good example of this. And that looks like this. And it's a bit like bad news, but it's a bit more streamlined and a bit more beautiful. And this is our latest project, which was released not too long ago, a week and a half or two, called Go Viral. In case you're interested, please go to goviralgame.com, which is a project about coronavirus misinformation. So how do you recognize what COVID misinformation looks like and what strategies that are used to spread it? Specifically, fear-mongering, impersonating fake experts, right? Like this Swedish Nobel Prize winner says coronavirus is fake. How do you recognize that type of content? And also, as I mentioned before, conspiracy theory. So 5G, that kind of content, right? What patterns does it use and how do you recognize it? And this is in collaboration with the United Kingdom's Cabinet Office, the UN's Verified campaign, and the World Health Organization. So tremendously interesting project. In case you're interested, please go to goviralgame.com. It's now available in English, German, and French. And as we speak, or as I'm speaking, we are doing some research on how effective this game specifically is at improving people's ability to spot COVID misinformation. So the study will be launched very soon, and we are hoping to publish it still this year, but that might be a bit optimistic because of the nature of academic publications being a bit slow. Just to give you a bit of a taste, this is what the game looks like from the inside. This is the front page on the left, and on the right you see what you might call a fake social media post by someone who is very upset about toilet paper related to coronavirus. And you can see that you can get likes, and also you have to gain credibility in the vein of the bad news game that I played before. that's it. I'm at 35 minutes, which leaves us, well, a good 20 minutes to do some questions, and I very much look forward to your input, your ideas. If you have any questions, please let me know. You can see my email address here, jjr51@cam.ac.uk, Cam for Cambridge. And yeah, happy to have talked to you, and I hope you all have a very nice rest of your day and conference.